So introduction, my name is Sian Basker. I'm co-chief executive of Data Orchard. We are a social enterprise that specializes in helping other organizations to get better with data. We focus entirely on the not-for-profit sector, so charities, social enterprises, public sector organizations. And we've been researching data maturity since 2015. It's probably useful at this point to describe what we mean by data maturity. So essentially, we define it as an organization's journey towards improvement and increased capability in using data. And when we talk about data, we take a very holistic view at Data Orchard. So essentially, it's all the types of information that you collect, store, analyze, and use. I think it would be useful to start off by giving you a little bit of a potted history of data maturity. So back in 2010, I suppose I would call it the epiphany, because there was a huge amount of media attention around data and big data and open data. And it was a really exciting time because people like Hans Rosling were delivering incredible TED Talks about wealth and health inequalities and using incredible data visualizations that were very interactive. There was a lot of publication from organizations like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation were publishing on UK poverty. And it was a real sort of epiphany moment for quite a lot of people, because there was this realization that this had incredible power and potential. And imagine if we could harness the power of this incredible technology for making the world a better place, the power of data for good. And also a sense of sharing. So there was a sort of openness and sharing that was coming around that sort of indicated that, gosh, if we could all share this information and create a shared understanding of the problems, that we could find solutions to these problems through collaboration more quickly and more effectively and better and more sustainably. So in 2013, that is when Data Orchard was created, and there were a group of 8 of us who all came from researchy, data, statsy kind of backgrounds and had been working in most cases for decades in the non-profit sector or the public sector. And we had this real sort of passion about how data was going to help us make the world a better place, socially, economically, and environmentally. And we weren't the only ones. There was a whole gathering of other organizations coming into being around that time. So the ODI had just started up, DataKind UK opened up in the same year, the OR Society started its pro bono economics work. And NPC, existing organizations were starting to do interesting things with data. So NPC were doing some really leading work around the Justice Data Lab, which was about impact measurement and data sharing and between different sectors. So there was this real sense of momentum around data for good as a sort of cause. In 2015, this is when we started our research on data maturity models, and we discovered there were hundreds of them. Almost all of them were very commercial sector. They were primarily aimed at very technical audiences, largely in these sort of huge analytics teams in huge enterprises. And we found that the language and the context didn't really work or translate for the not-for-profit sector. And we realized we needed to create our own, essentially. And at this time, we were partnering with DataKind UK. And so for the next year, we focused on doing our first research. I should say, I think like any decent non-profit organization who's driven to make change, one of the starting points is understanding the problem and the need. Sorry, I've just realized I should turn that off. Thank you, that's a bit annoying. So I proposed we do a national survey. And I remember asking my colleague, Charlotte, who's a demographer and a statistician, I said, what kind of sample size should I be aiming for so that it's really representative? And she said, well, if it's national, given the sector, probably about 2,000 will do it. And I said, right, okay, we're going to cap it at 2,000. We'll go out there, we'll go national, we'll promote it via all the infrastructure organisations and all the networks nationally, regionally, locally, but we're going to cap it at 2,000. So after six or 8 weeks, we had about 150 responses to our very short and carefully honed survey about data in the non-profit sector. And so we spent a little bit more time crawling and begging organisations to complete it. And we eventually got about 200 charities and social enterprises to complete it. But it was enough to start conversations. We also did workshops, and it was enough for us to start digging under the bonnet. So we picked a really diverse range of organisations to go and look really closely at where they were at with data and what factors were important. And we did some quite fun workshops as well in that time. Perhaps there are people here in the audience who attended those and took part. And we really enjoyed learning together and really engaging with the sector on it. So, ta-da! In 2017, we published our first social sector data maturity framework, and along with that, the report that we'd done on the research. Essentially, it was a theoretical descriptor of each stage for each of the key themes, and I'll explain a bit more about those in a bit more detail shortly. We had lots of really positive feedback about it. Some organisations like the International Red Cross told us, oh yeah, we loved your framework. We got 30 people in a room for 2 days. We worked our way through it and we built our whole organisation strategy on the back of it. And that was really positive and exciting, but it wasn't really very accessible and digestible to your average person, given that there was not that much interest in the concept of data or data maturity. It wasn't really that helpful. And people were saying, well, what questions should we be asking ourselves? And we as an organisation interested in impact measurement were interested in how you score and benchmark and weight the questions and things like that. So with the help of a grant from Stanford University and later on another grant from the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, we did even more research on how we could create this, turn this framework into something more useful. In 2018, we put together the partnership for the first Data4Good conference. I'll be honest and say originally we envisaged that was going to be when we launched our online tool. But indeed, it was another whole year before the online product happened. But ta-da! In October 2019, we launched the first free online data maturity assessment tool. And indeed, we refreshed the framework and created a version 2 of the theoretical framework at the time as well. And that followed last year, in February last year, we were able to launch something our dream product really, which is a more advanced version, which enables multiple people from an organisation to take the assessment and is a bit more customizable. We also last year did our first impact report a year after we'd been live, and I'm not going to talk about that today, but I'll throw the links in later. But that was just really reassuring about the impact it was having on the users. So today, ta-da, finally, we're here with the first state of the sector analysis of data maturity. And I'm really going to be talking about what the data says about data maturity. So I hope you're all data-y people, because it's going to be a bit data-y. So first things first, this is the framework. This is the simple framework of data maturity. Essentially, it maps out a 5-stage journey from unaware, emerging, learning, developing, mastering, and it identifies these 7 key themes that are really important. So a couple of them are very much about purpose. This came up in Jason's presentation earlier. So the purposes for which you're using it, the questions you're asking in order to analyze, are obviously key drivers. There have to be the foundational things. So obviously you have to have the data and you have to have the tools to collect and store and analyze, etc. But crucially, a huge amount of data maturity is about people. So it's about skills, it's about leadership, and it's about culture. So the assessment is essentially an online questionnaire designed around those 7 themes, and it digs into some sub-themes within each of those areas. It takes about 20 minutes to complete, and I'll give you a quick demo in a moment. I do want to just say about data maturity assessment being several things. It is considerably a process. So it is really about engaging people, a process of engagement before, during, and after the assessment. When we did our impact research, the biggest finding was around learning. So it is an educational tool, and it really enables people to create a sort of shared thinking and language about the problems and opportunities to improve. It is also an output in that you get a report and in some cases some data. And it's also the start of a journey. So in particular, it's a catalyst for action. This is what people are telling us. We know this from those that we work with very directly, but even for those that we don't, most go on to develop some kind of plan and investment in resources to improve. So, this is what happens. You take the assessment, it takes about 20 minutes, and you get a report that looks like this online. So it will tell you which of those stages you're in. So in this case, it's saying the organization is in the emerging stage. Whoops, I've got a bit jumped ahead a little bit there. It will give you a comparison in relation to the sector. So it will score you across the 7 themes here. It will identify where you're strongest and identify the areas you're likely to need to focus on. So in this case, they're recommending leadership, uses, and analysis. And then you can dig in a little bit further and find out more. It's trying to hone you into, like, let's not try and do all 7 areas, but like, let's pick 2 or 3 that we should really focus on. So given this one focused on leadership, drilling into the leadership theme, it will just tell you a little bit more about how you're doing compared to others, but focuses specifically on where we think you are now and what the next stage would look like for you. I've just realised this isn't leadership, is it? It's skills. Apologies. So, but yeah. So for each of the stage that it's suggesting you look at, it's really a case of just trying to focus on next stage. Let's not try and go to 0 to 60 in no time at all. So. That's the kind of basic free version. There is the organization version that allows, it works a little bit more sophisticatedly for having multiple people. So each individual gets their own report on how they self-assessed. And then there's a whole organization summary report, and you can get a copy of your organization's data back. And we also do custom reporting and bespoking for our clients who choose to do that. So, here's the big question. How many have taken the data maturity assessment? So we are specifically focusing on the period between October 2019, when we launched, and December 2020. The big headline, 2,119 respondents. How fabulous. And I suppose that comes back to my thing of how representative is the data of the sector. However, after cleaning and validation and matching, actually that number comes down to 630 respondents. And there is this issue. It's really important about the multiple people. You know, you've got to get multiple perspectives on an organization to really get the full picture. And so we really encourage multiple people to take it. So that's the big picture there. But then after we exclude commercial organizations, it comes down to just 202 not-for-profit organizations. And after excluding those who have taken the taster, because we've got a quickie 5-minute taster version of it, then actually what we've come down to is 501 respondents from 133 non-profits who have completed the full assessment. So just talking about what kinds of organizations are using it, just in terms of the not-for-profit sector that we're mostly focusing on. Unsurprisingly, most of them are NGO, which is our collective term for charities and social enterprise. Don't get me going on legal forms of organisations. I've got a whole appendix in the big report on that in itself. But you can see it's been used primarily in the UK and primarily by the NGO sector, but also a bit by public sector and universities. And it's also been used internationally in 29 different countries, I think. There's quite a range of the type of organisations, not so many of the smaller ones, but quite a lot of the sort of mid-range and higher scale organisations. So it's quite varied in terms of income, and we know from drilling into the geography that it's from all over different countries and regions of the UK. The types of organisation by activity, I've thrown the commercial ones back in here just for you to see, but we've blocked those almost all in one area. It's complicated, isn't it? But it does give a quite an interest. So the blue here are the NGO, non-governmental organisations. The red are the public sector ones. So as you can see, it's quite a range, and it matches quite a lot with the sector. So there's a lot in social service areas, health and education in particular, but then you've got grant making foundations in there as well, and local, regional, national government. So the big question I'm sure everybody's waiting for, the big launch, the data maturity overview of the sector is, ta-da, this. Most are learning is the short answer. An encouraging number are shifting into the developing stage. There are some still lagging at the emerging, and a really small number mastering. You'll see there are almost none unaware, and I think that's not surprising, because if you're not at all interested in data, you're very unlikely to take a data maturity assessment. Strengths and weaknesses around the themes. As you can see, there's not really very much in it, but strongest in data and culture, and I think that's really encouraging. I think there's no lack of data for sure, and I think the culture of openness and sharing is really positive, and there's a lot of work gone on around protection and security. The weakest areas are skills, leadership, and analysis. I'm sure you're dying to know, is there much difference between the sectors? We were just curious, so we had to look. The scale at the bottom is essentially the stages, so unaware, emerging, learning, and you can see everybody's learning. It doesn't matter what sector you're in, everybody's in the learning stage. But of course, the numbers are still quite small. We don't make any claims about this being representative, but these are the results of those who have taken the data maturity assessment. That said, there's a huge amount of variation. So each of the dots here represents how an organisation scored in the data maturity assessment for each of the themes, and you can see it really, really varies. And particularly, it seems to me there's a lot of diversity of scoring and staging and thinking about data, particularly around things like leadership and skills themselves. So, I mean, it is an absolutely huge data set, and it's been a little bit challenging really trying to work out and extract back, as one has with all of this data, about what's interesting and important. But I have picked out at least one thing from each of the 7 themes that I'd like to share with you today. So I'm hoping, I've tried not to put, well, there are charts. There's at least one chart for each, but I'm hoping you're data people, so you'll be a kind audience on that front. So data. This was the question here was, to what extent do you agree or disagree that our data is complete, accurate, and where necessary kept up to date? What you can see is only 12% are really confident about the quality of their data, and half disagree or are neutral on the issue. And I think the lesson here really is, as we all know, that data is really hard. Keeping data, good quality data, is something quite time consuming. It's something you have to work at all the time. Refer to my previous slide on data cleaning, this very data set. And it is endless. just goes on. And I'm pretty sure the analogy around data being the new oil that was fan-fed back in the 2010 runs out here, because I feel quite strongly, particularly in the non-profit sector, that it's a bit more like an orchard. You know, if you're lucky, you'll have people in your organization who really nurture and care about the data and the data quality, but it's a real challenge and a real resource intensive thing to do. The second key finding, I suppose, is this one. So this is about how organizations are using data in terms of how they in relating to their services and purposes of the organization. And what you can see on the bottom here is there's a lot of counting going on. There's a lot of recording activity and work with the clients. Encouragingly, there's quite a lot around, you know, performance, monitoring performance. But then there's less of the harder stuff. So less of the evidencing the needs, profiling the clients, and you know, this one is quite hard. The thing around impact evaluation and outcomes. But do refer to NPC, who have got brilliant resources on that. But it is hard. It's a tough thing to do. Also on the uses theme is that we really notice, despite using data for all of these different purposes, in terms of actually reaping the benefits for internal capabilities, it's not really getting there as much as you hoped. I think Jason mentioned previously about learning. And actually, for all of that work with data, only what, 40% or so are saying that it's impacting their levels of knowledge and expertise. Even in like strategic planning and decision making, you've probably got, what, about a quarter there who are really reaping the benefits, maybe 2/3 to some extent. And of course, what's also interesting here is lots of don't know. So they don't even, you know, lots of people don't know if the data's working for them or not. Tools is an interesting one. Some of them are using quite advanced tools. So you can see up here some of the more sort of data sciencey things that DataKind specialize in, for example, you know, are right up there, but they're not, you know, they're quite early days. So ditto, some are starting to edge into these kind of business intelligence dashboards that are bringing things together. There's a lot of database CRM stuff rooting for you. I know there's lots of themes at the festival on that subject. We could talk for a year on that, definitely. But of course, if you look down the bottom here, spreadsheets. Everybody uses spreadsheets. I use spreadsheets. Everybody uses them. But there's also down here, even like manual visual counts is quite widespread, and one wonders about this until you look at the next slide, which tells us that things are still quite paper-based. So I find this quite an interesting area, given I think one can't be too judgmental about it, because given that our sector works with many of the most marginalized and disadvantaged people, it's very likely that they're going to be working with people who are digitally excluded, you know, elderly people, and in situations and contexts where digital technology or data collection is just not appropriate. It's not the same as online sales of products or online search engines kind of data. It's when we're talking about working with vulnerable groups, it can be quite different. And I think when we delved a little bit deeper and asked, well, you know, to what extent are you collecting data digitally so you don't have to retype it from the forms? 69% said they did. So it's often a hybrid situation. It is true, though, that less than half said that their organization collects data in consistent and efficient ways. And so I think there's a very strong argument for digital maturity alongside data maturity, because you can't analyze data at all unless it's digitized, unless of course you're doing those manual counts through the filing cabinet of papers, which is also quite widespread. Moving on to culture, I loved culture, but culture for us, when we define it, is about sort of almost two sides of the equation. So partly it's about openness and sharing, and partly it's about protection and security. And the questions that we had around protection and security indicated that actually the sector's doing quite well. There's been quite an emphasis since the GDPR legislation came out around that sort of thing. Probably 75-80% are doing really well. There's about 20%, 15, 20, 25% who are still grappling a bit with that. But the culture is pretty good in terms of the openness and sharing. There is a lot of collaboration that goes on. It's different for every organization, but there's a lot of data sharing between organizations. There's increasingly shared measures and benchmarks that are being used across subsectors. So that's really exciting. What is really hard, though, is some of this stuff which is going to the hard place, because as a sector very passionate about what it does and very convinced of its impact, this question about using data to ask difficult questions and challenge our practices is not a comfortable place for everybody, and it's something that you have to work out. So just moving on to the last three themes, these are the ones that were identified as weakest. So just over a third say they've got the right skills and capabilities to maximize the use of their data. I don't think that's at all surprising, because this data and analytics field has seen absolutely revolutionary change over the last decade, and it's quite hard to keep up, even for those of us for whom data is our core business. So I think it's a challenge, because most people don't know what's possible, and I think it's also a problem that you don't know what you don't know. So that's why this idea of learning and community and skills development and knowledge sharing is so important at all levels in the sector. Types of analysis. I saw Dulcie Woosden deliver a great presentation yesterday on data science, where she was exploring very well the predictive and prescriptive analytics. Again, I would say here, there's lots of counting. This basic counts and charts is quite prevalent. Also quite descriptive analytics. There's a lot about what happened in the past. So, all of those annual reports or reports to the board that are done quarterly or wherever, or to funders on a regular basis, they're typically summarizing what's happened in the past and what's been done. Less so of the really drilling into it and exploring the sort of diagnostics of why things are happening and looking at the anomalies. Less so, even more, the predictive analytics. We think quite a lot of this, actually. It seems quite high given our experience, but you will notice the slide on the tools looked at finance software, and probably this is to do with cash flow forecasting, which is crucial for any organization, especially one as financially vulnerable as the non-profit sector. So that's the picture that we got around analysis. And then the final thing that I wanted to talk about was leadership. And this is I feel really excited and encouraged that I can see those 12% at the forefront who are really data driven. They've got leaders who really understand how to use data to improve what the organization does. They prioritize it as a vital resource. And I'm even encouraged at this 40% in the engaged and supportive, because that's a really positive move. But then if you look at everybody else, we're talking nearly half of leaders have still got to be convinced about the value of data. And I think this is really surprising because you should really consider how much they're spending on it. And this next slide, we ask everybody in an organization, everybody who takes the assessment, to tell us what kind of job they do and how much of their job is spent working with data. And So this is what the data shows from all of those people who have completed the full assessment. And unsurprisingly, if you're in a data management or analysis role, you would expect to be doing it quite a lot. And there's a lot of people who work in impact evaluation, researchy roles, ditto. Finance, obviously, the administrators, feeling for them, but they do a lot of it. But it actually is in everybody's job, whatever your job title, and there aren't always that many who have got, data strategist or scientist or manager in their job title, but everybody's job involves working with data. So in fact, already, and this relates to the previous point I made about efficiency savings, is pretty consistently, and we've done this with whole organization assessments over the last several years, pretty consistently they're spending 40 to 50% of their salary bill on working with data. And I think this is quite shocking, usually, especially because in our sector, the salary bill is often the biggest part of the outgoing budget. So it seems to invest all of that time and effort and not reap the rewards and benefits is ... Stick some words in the chat, please. I'll be interested to see what you think. So just to wrap up towards the end here, how the data maturity assessment can be used. Sector benchmarking, this is our first time that we've done sector benchmarking. We're envisaging it being an annual thing. We use it quite a lot for internal benchmarking, where you want to identify, particularly in quite large organizations, which parts or teams are doing really well with data, and who are the leaders and laggers, and what can you learn from your internal experience and skills. Bespoke benchmarking is where, if you work in like housing or education, or you're a local authority and you just want to compare how you're doing, then we can compare against any of those categories. Then there's repeat measures and cohort assessments, and I'll just talk briefly about those. Repeat assessments are great if you're planning to do something after your data maturity assessment. This is an example here of a cancer charity that we started working with in June 2018. And so the blue lines points linked to their baseline assessment before we started working with them. How were they doing? The green we remeasured at the end of a year working together with them. Some interesting changes in both directions. And then we measured again a year later, so a year after we'd stopped working with them, to see how they were getting on. And obviously, it's fairly crucial if your job is about helping others get better with data, that you want to see what the lasting impact of your support interventions is. Then cohort assessments. So we are in the middle at the moment of working with Data4Wise. Superhighways are an organisation that are running this programme, and they have a cohort of other organisations that they're supporting. And so we have done a data maturity assessment of the whole cohort. So all of those organisations have done an assessment, and we will be reassessing again very shortly to see how things have shifted for that whole cohort over a period of time. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Some further information and resources. Firstly, the report is coming out at some point when I've finished writing it. So do join our mailing list. We will be publishing the report and you'll hear about it there. But also we intend to run a whole range of events around data maturity for different audiences. So again, join up for that. If you would like to take the free data maturity assessment, it's available online, absolutely free. If you're interested in finding about our organisation version or the agency partner versions, you can find out more there. Do get in touch. And finally, we've been gathering some data maturity resources. So not just the model and the questions, but actually some real stories about organisations' journeys. And so we've got lots of case studies. You can see our impact reports. All of that is available on the website. So I'm going to shut down the presentation and come back to the questions. So let's have a look. If an organisation is more or less at the same stage across all 7 themes, where should efforts be prioritised first? Is there a standard to this, or varies from organisation to organisation? Thank you. Thank you, Tio. Usually there is, they're not going to be exactly the same. I think one of the things that's most interesting is the diversity of opinion. So sometimes that's another factor. Like I have a hypothesis, and when we've got more data, we will check it out. My hypothesis is that more advanced organizations are more consistent in their different levels. But I have yet to prove it. I think it's the conversation. So some of the things we talk about are, where's the diversity of opinion? Is there a lot of consensus opinion around these questions and themes? Also, what doesn't the organization know that it should know? So I think it's really a tool for dialogue, and usually we will facilitate that. Or sometimes, you know, there's a person in-house who's a data specialist who just takes the data and explores that themselves. So it's really a conversation starter. I've never had it that an organization is exactly equal in every theme, but I'll keep you posted. Ros Thomasu, about how we can support leaders. Yeah, I'm really interested in this because I think it's the absolute key is getting leaders. We used to ask questions about whether leaders thought it was important or whether they valued it. And we've changed the question to be more around investment. How much do you agree or disagree that your leaders invest in data? And I think that's a really important indicator of where the leadership is at, is whether they're investing in it. And I think leaders need a lot of help in understanding this whole realm and the what's possible, which is why I'm particularly interested in this idea of cohort assessments, because one of the ways that people pay attention is, you know, they're interested in what I call PLUs, people like us, or in this case, organizations like us. So if you get a whole group of organizations that are operating in the same sector, you know, domestic violence or, you know, learning disability, for example, and you get all of them to take an assessment together, then you start to identify those that are at the forefront, those that are doing really powerful, interesting things. And I think there's a lot that can be shared and learned from the leaders and those at the forefront that can help accelerate things for others. And I think they're more interested in it if it's a context that's related to them. So we've tried as much to do it as it's the non-profit sector, but the non-profit sector is really diverse and broad. And so there's that. The other thing is we're talking to superhighways as well about creating specific courses for leaders and doing some short events aimed at leaders to try and, you know, I suppose help them to understand the value of data and its potential in helping them to use it in their cause. Any other questions from anyone? I'm looking at the Q&A column. Will the assessment risk overwhelming much smaller charities? Well, hang on, let's just move down. Who don't have the capacity to deal with everything? Yeah, that's an interesting one. We did, the sector is primarily really small organisations, and that's why we've worked so hard to try and ask the questions in accessible ways, assuming people are not data specialists when they complete it. And I think there is this sense of overwhelm if you look at the whole data field in its entirety of all the ways you're using it in your organization across all of the themes at all of those stages. It is too much, and that's why we try to break it down. And that's, so I would say, you know, one of the great things about the free tool is often if it's a really small charity, you can get, you know, half a dozen people taking it together, and the conversations you have as you start completing the questions and the dialogue and the debates about how to answer it are really useful. And we've had great feedback from small organizations on that. So when I talk about it being a process, that's really what I mean. And I think, you know, it's only really by starting with where you're at and helping to focus in on 2 or 3 areas. And you can only really know that from the context of your organization about what you might need to do. But there are lots of support and resources available. From your experience, do organizations do better in data maturity if they have specific teams focused on data, or if a focus is made on upskilling staff? I think this is a chance for my it's my magic 8 ball. I'm joking, really, although it does says, oh, it's tell you what it says. It says consult me later. There you go, Charlotte Sansom, consult me later. That is a really good question. We have tried really hard to find out about what dedicated people in teams, and we're trying to do it as a proportion, like how many dedicated data people do you have, how many employees do you have. It is astonishing how many people don't know how many employees there are in their organization. And also, once you get to very large organizations, not many people know who those data specialist teams are. So it's not proved very helpful to work out which ones have or haven't got data specialists on the team. I think there are 2 aspects to it. So we ask partly about those specialist skills, but also about the general data literacy. And it's still less than half of the organization, of the respondents would say they've got a data literate organization. And I think our approach is that it has to be that combination. You need those specialist skills and people, but unless the whole organization is engaged, because everybody's working with data, and unless you're upping, you know, the frontline staff, the service delivery staff in terms of their access to tools and information to help them do their jobs better, then you're not going to move the organization forward. It is that whole collective holistic approach. So I think there's an argument for both. And in many ways, I'd probably start with the upskilling everybody. Kirsten, as part of the assessment process, do you also offer ways or partners to help them fix areas where they are low and if they have no data expertise? We have got on among our resources on our website, we have a list of where to get help with data. So it's a whole list of, it can include pro bono organizations, it includes freelance consultants, it includes organizations like ourselves. There's a real mix out there. So we don't specifically use it. It's at the moment, I would say the tool is more diagnostic rather than prescribing what organizations need to do, but we do point to where there is help available. So please do check that out, or do get in touch with Data Orchard. Any other questions? I think that's all. I've probably run over terribly. So thank you all very much for participating and attending today. It's really weird not being able to see you, but thank you at least for being there in the chat channel. And we will be around. We've got an expo booth, which myself or some of my colleagues will be on at any time. Do please come back with any questions, and I look forward to continuing the journey. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.